I appreciate everyone coming up. I know everybody's busy. I know there's a lot going on in your lives, but there's also some really important things happening in our country. And now's the time to stand up. I'm going to talk about some of those important things, but I also want to just give you a little bit of a heads up that I'm going to address this at a very deep level. I'm not going to talk about the problem of the moment, the problem of the day, the problem of the year. I'm going to talk about what's really wrong here. And when you start to understand what's really wrong, you start to get a better feel for what is it we have to be prepared to do. So that's really my mission tonight. And I want everybody to accept it in that light that I'm not running for office. I'm not starting some grand movement. Think of this as a tavern in Boston in 1775. We're just citizens talking to each other. And we're talking about serious things, and we have some serious decisions to make. So that's what this is about. Everybody okay with that? So here's the agenda. The first thing on the agenda is a little bit of a preamble about American exceptionalism. And you're probably wondering, well, why is he talking about that? I thought he came here to talk about the problems in America. Well, what you're going to find as I go through this is that these challenges that I'm going to talk about are actually directly tied to this concept of American exceptionalism and the world's attempt to reject it. So the 5 challenges that I'm going to go through in some detail are creeping collectivism, state-run education, post-constitutionalism in America, the fact that there's now 2 Americas, and I'm going to talk about something called the Grand Illusion. And after that, I'm going to talk about the path forward, at least from my view. You don't have to agree with it. Again, this is just citizens talking, exchanging thoughts, and trying to come to grips with what we have to do here. So let's talk about American exceptionalism. Now, the first thing that you should ask is, exceptional compared to what? I mean, are we the smartest people in the world? Are we the tallest? Are we the richest? Are we the best looking? What makes us exceptional? Well, the answer is none of that. And I'm going to talk about what actually does make us exceptional. Skousen called it, you probably heard of a book called The 5,000-Year Leap. Well, the reason he said that was all of history had been of basically the same vintage. It was basically the aristocrats, the elites, the landed gentry, the people in power running the world, and everybody else were subjects to them. They really had no control over what was going on. Their life was miserable, and they had no freedom, and they had no control. So what happened with our revolution was an astonishing change of events. We essentially turned the world completely upside down because what happened was common people, us, common people, so we've had enough of it. You know, when we told King George we were done, we weren't just saying, hey, we want a different king, we want King Alfred or something like that. We weren't even saying we wanted a monarchy or we didn't want the House of Lords. We didn't want any of that. We didn't want the Archbishop of Canterbury. We were done with all of the aristocrats and all the elites in the world telling us what to do. And for the first time in the history of the world, common people took control of their own fate. And they told the aristocrats of the world, we're kicking out. And we did it, unfortunately, it came to violence, but we did it rather violently. We had a revolution in America, and it was a battle that we won. But the important thing about this was, it was such a profound change in the moral structure of how people related to their government. So, for instance, I boil it down to 3 things in this moral revolution. The first one is sort of an outgrowth of Christianity, and the notion that each person is born with intrinsic worth, that each person has a soul, that each person is sacred. And that gave rise to the concept in America of individual sovereignty and individual responsibility. And that was really Christ's view of how people should relate to the world and to the government. Another important concept that to the foundation of America came from Judaism, which is that everyone is equal before the law. And again, this was a rather astonishing departure from history because in all of history, the kings, the queens, the monarchs, the barons, the landed gentry, they were the law and often above the law. And we simply had to comply with it. Uh, the birth of America gave rise to a very different notion. Everyone is equal before the law. And what our founders did is they took these kinds of principles and they said the moral purpose of government, the moral purpose of government is to safeguard those two principles, that we're sovereign individuals and we're all equal before the law. I just want you to pause for a moment and think about how astonishing of a change that was in world history. We literally took the world and all of history upside down. So what came of that? In my view, the most wondrous thing in the history of the world came from that. I believe America has been the greatest country in the history of the world. I believe the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were the two greatest political documents ever crafted by man. It gave rise to unparalleled wealth and freedom, this concept of people being free to do what they want to do, to be able to own property, to own what their hands produce, gave rise to incredible wealth and productivity. And it's been, if you look at, for thousands of years, if you looked at a graph of the average income per day of the average person in the world, it was about $100 a day based on current dollars. That went on for thousands of years where everybody was basically dirt poor. Starting in 1776, if you looked at that graph, which was a straight line for thousands of years, it took a sudden spike upward. And all of a sudden, the world discovered we can become wealthy, not just the kings and queens, but everybody here on this planet can become wealthy. And that was part of our revolution. This whole concept of individual sovereignty and limited government limited by a constitution, again, that was another result of this American exceptionalism, and it's part of the foundation of American exceptionalism. One way to look at it, being a libertarian, this is how I like to summarize it, is it's a philosophy of free minds, free markets, and free people. As I mentioned earlier, the world and all of history were turned upside down, and basically what we did was we kicked the elites to the curb. We basically told all of the people who had been in power up to that point in history that we the people are going to take control. And we're going to decide who our leaders are going to be, and we're going to craft a constitution that limits what they can do, not what we can do. So in my view, that's what American exceptionalism is. Now the problem was the elites didn't like the fact that they had been kicked to the curb. So what's happened ever since then is the revenge of the elites against everyone else. That there's folks in the world, people who I'm going to call part of the political class versus the economic class, which I believe most of the rest of us to be. In that political class, there's people who have two strong urges. One is they want to have the control and power to shift the burdens of life onto others. They want others to do things for them. They want to gain their wealth by people working for them on their behalf. They want to live in a castle. They want to live in a palace. They want life to be grand. They want servants. They want slaves. The other thing that you'll see in the political class is that a lot of people have notions of what they want the world to be like. In fact, we probably all have notions of what we want the world to be like. And if we were king for a day, we'd probably like to be king for a day to tell other people what to do. But there's a lot of people in the world who simply want to take their personal purpose, their personal vision, and turn it into everybody else's purpose and everybody else's vision. So that's what that political class is. They want the control, the power, and they want their vision of the world to become your vision of the world. It's not a case of rich versus poor. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. I love richness. I love wealth. But I love it when it comes through value creation as opposed to wealth through coercion. I don't like it when that wealth comes through using the levers and the powers and the regulatory capabilities and the taxation ability of government. I like it when people go out and in a free market deliver value to customers. And if they're successful doing that, become rich, I love that. But that's the difference in the world. And what we're going to talk about here in this struggle is you've got the politicians of the world, the bureaucrats, the bankers, the oligarchs, the financiers, the consultants, the lobbyists. They're all part of that political class, that elitist group. And what they're trying to do is retake control from the people who really started the American Revolution, which is the common people, the farmers, the producers, retailers, managers, truck drivers, doctors, all the people who actually deliver real value in our society. They're trying to take the control back from us. So what they're after is a government and a system of control of the elites, by the elites, and for the elites, versus what was the original foundation of that American exceptionalism, which is of the people, by the people, and for the people. So unfortunately, over the last couple of hundred years, the elites have regained a lot of ground, and they're retaking control of America. Just a few tidbits of information. Right now in the world, less than 1,000 people control 90% of the world's wealth. Less than 1,000 people. Here in America, in the last 30 years, we've seen 1,000% more millionaires, 500% more billionaires, just in the last 30 years. Again, if they earned it through value creation in the free market, I have no objection to that. If they earned it by taking control of the levers of government and taking control of our society to create a favorable situation for them, by which they can profit, I object to that completely. Another small tidbit, the 1% in America now have more assets than the entire middle class in America. And if you look at where that wealth is concentrated, if you look at a map of the U.S. and stratified by wealth, it's almost all in the urban areas where the big institutions are located, whether it's the big banks, the government offices, the big universities. All of the wealth is really concentrated in those small pinpricks around the country. The rest of the country, it's not there. So this trend, where we started from a country of a radical concept of individual sovereignty and limited government, to where we're now moving back towards control by the elites and a movement back towards collectivism. That's really what the 5 challenges we're going to talk about are all related to. They all have something in common. It's related to this conflict, the elites versus everyone else. This has been, in my view, at least 150 years in the making, and it's far bigger than any one issue. I mean, if you just decide I want to fight a battle on one issue, you're missing the bigger picture. It's bigger than one politician. It's bigger than one party. It's bigger than one ideology. This is about the core of what it means to be an American. So challenge number 1, creeping collectivism. And when I say collectivism, I know people want to think socialism and communism, and I think I've come to learn that's a bit of a mistake. Because every time you say, hey, that's a socialist program, or you're a socialist, or we're moving towards socialism, they always deny it and say, no, that's not what real socialism is, that's not what I mean, that's not what Marx meant. And it's kind of true, because it's all very squishy, it's like punching a jellyfish. But if you talk about collectivism, collectivism includes socialism, it includes communism, it includes totalitarianism. It includes elitist bureaucratic control, which is what we have in America right now. We have this deep state, and we have these elitist institutions that are basically running the country now. To me, that's part of that collectivist movement. It's really an attempt to move all of the power in a small group of people into a centralized enclave like Washington, and to make everybody's lives a function of collective action rather than individual action like we started out in this country. So we now become part of big movements like climate change and resolving racial equity, and we have to sacrifice our sovereignty to address those issues. So what's happened, if you look at, if any of you are familiar with Karl Marx and his actual theories of socialism and communism, the revolution he described, which was a capitalist industrial society starting a revolution as the workers rise up against the owners and start a battle, and that revolution leads to socialism, which leads to communism. What people learned about America on the left is that kind of revolution was never going to happen. The workers were never going to pick up their pitchforks and tackle the owners and the industrialists and start an armed revolution in America. So what they did was they started 2 things. You can pick either name. You can call it progressivism, which is sort of a creeping movement towards socialism without that revolution, or neo-Marxism, which is just saying, basically, hey, Marx was wrong, so let's just try a different attempt towards collectivism. So what they're doing, instead of that class conflict that Marx talked about, where the workers are going to rise up and kill the industrialists, they have to invent other conflicts, whether it's a race conflict in America, critical race theory and white guilt, gender and sexual orientation conflicts, the climate offenders versus the climate victims, those who are successful versus those who are unsuccessful, meaning they want equity of outcomes regardless of effort. Even your COVID vaccination status is creating a class conflict in America. These are all things that Marx never talked about. That's why I don't like to call it socialism or communism anymore. But they are all collectivist movements. And they all require two things. One of them is to resolve them, at least in the view of the leftists, they all need bigger government, more coercion, and less individual freedom. That's what they all of these things, the solution magically, again, requires bigger government, more coercion, less freedom. The other thing that you'll see is part of what's intended for all of these conflicts is a permanent crisis in America. And I don't know if you've sensed that lately, but it seems like you pick up the paper every day or look at the news, and every day we're in a crisis. It's been the COVID crisis. It's been the race conflict crisis. It's been the climate crisis. That's very intentional, because that's all intended to accentuate these conflicts and convince us that the world's coming unglued and the only solution is bigger government and collectivism and less individual sovereignty. So how do we see that in the world right now? How do we see that in America? One thing you've probably noticed is a growing dependence on the government, that there's more and more people who rely on the government for their living than before. Here's an interesting stat. Since the year 2000, the population in America has gone up by 51 million. So we're now at about 340 million. That's a lot of people. But while the population went up 51 million, the number of people actually working is down 6 million. Now you can probably feel that in the country right now. It seems like no matter where you go, it's hard to get people to do the work. It's hard to get good service. It's hard to get products on the shelf. Something's changing in America, and it's this movement towards collectivism. Another thing that you'll see as a result of this creeping collectivism is that political power has a ratchet function. And by that I mean it never gets less. That even though we started out this country with a revolution, ever since that revolution, and I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail in another slide, ever since that revolution, our individual freedoms have been slowly ebbing away, and we've been slowly getting a bigger government, and we've been slowly moving towards this thing called collectivism. And it's part of the nature of democracy to some extent, pure democracy. I'm not talking about a constitutional republic. In a pure democracy, what do politicians have to offer but simply more government, more programs, more money, more spending? That's really all they have to offer. And that's really what happens, unfortunately, even in our own country, which isn't a pure democracy. You still see that dynamic where politicians, you got to do something, so they're going to institute the next program, the next benefit, the next handout to somebody. That never goes in the other direction. Once those programs are implemented, once they start, once you create the expectation that you're going to get this handout, it never goes away. That's why I call it a ratchet function. It only goes in one direction. It gets bigger. I'm going to talk about, really, in my view, what is driving, or what is the Achilles heel of communism and what's happening in America right now. One of the basic human motives is everybody prefers better rather than worse. And by that I mean, if you think about any situation or any condition in your life, you prefer the better outcome rather than the worse outcome. And you may define that in your own personal way, but nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, geez, I'd like something worse to happen to me. People want more love, they want more friendship, they want a better house, they want a better job, they want an easier way to do something. It's part of being a human being is that you want better rather than worse. So under capitalism, better means fairly simply that if you want to reap more benefits, you have to bring more value to society, whether that's working harder or coming up with new ideas or creative inventions. But better means you have to bring something good to the world. You have to bring something productive to the world. Under collectivism, better actually means the opposite. Because in a socialistic view or a collectivist view, and even in America where you start to see more people climbing into the wagon rather than pulling the wagon, when you've got a dynamic where, geez, it's easier not to work. Because I'll still get the benefits, I'll still get the food, I'll still get the housing, I'll still get the medical care, I'll still get my free phone, I'll still get whatever. You start to see this happen in this society. And under collectivism, that is the dynamic it creates. It's the exact opposite of the capitalist dynamic. And human nature will drive everybody to make this kind of decision, where it's better to do nothing. We're starting to see that everywhere. It's just simply better to do nothing than to take risks and work hard. And that's death for a society, and we're going down that path. Another way to look at it is graphically. If you look at the top 1% of the earners in America, there's not a lot of them. They earned about 17% of all the income in America last year, but they paid 37% of the taxes. Even though there's this, we got to tax the rich, and the tax structure is not fair. The rich are actually pulling a lot of the carts in this country. If you go to the opposite end of the scale, the bottom 50% of income earners in America earned about 13% of the total income, and they only paid 2% of the taxes. So we literally have almost half of our country who pay zero federal income tax. And so that's another indication of how collectivism is skewing that incentive to be a worker or to be the one pulling the cart versus the one who's going to get in the cart and go along for the ride. So challenge number 2 is state-run education. So why is this a challenge? Well, think about what has to happen to take a country like America that had, in my view, one of the greatest cultures ever, where we came to a new continent, we explored a new continent, we built a new continent. Think about what America has accomplished in the last 250 years. We basically, there was nothing here. And yet we're now the richest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world. We have the greatest assets and institutions in the world. But we're giving that all away, that culture that created that concept of capitalism, individual sovereignty, we're giving that away. And how can you convince people to do that? I mean, what fool would look at that culture and look at that results and say, geez, let's do something different? Well, the only way to do that is to convince young people and generations of people coming up in the country that this concept of individual sovereignty simply needs to be condemned. And you're going to hear that everywhere in our culture now, that individual sovereignty, individual responsibility, taking control of your own affairs is now a bad thing. And it's collectivism. If you listen to young people and listen to what they're being taught in school, they're being taught collectivism. They don't call it socialism, they don't call it communism, but they tell you that we're all in this together, we all have to pool our resources, we all have to sacrifice our individuality for the common good, and we have to give the power to the elites so they can make the right decisions to all of us. That's what's being taught in our schools right now. And the reason it's being taught is that's the only way to destroy this concept of individual sovereignty is to take the kids away from their parents and teach them a new view of life. And that's what's happened for the last 40 years in America. When you think about it, a school that's run by the state, and most of our schools are run by the state in America, what else are they going to teach about collectivism? They're collectivist institutes by nature. They're paid by the state. The state has a monopoly on that education. They collude with the teachers union, who basically has the monopoly of the labor going into it. And the system is funded by monopolistic revenue collection by the state. It's all a very statist concept. They all get their money through the power of the state. So if that's how you get your money, if that's how you earn your living, what else are you going to teach but statism and collectivism? Lenin said in Russia, when he was helping with the revolution there, that 4 years of indoctrination plants a seed that could never be uprooted. And so he thought, if you could just get a hold of the students for 4 years and teach them communism, that they'll never let go of that. And there's some truth to that. But think about what's happening in America right now. The state-run schools have our kids for 16 years, if you count 4 years of college. They have them 5 days a week. They have them 8 hours per day. That's a lot more time than Lenin was talking about. And so during that time, 16 years is a long time for a state-run institution to have control of your children's minds. One thing that struck me, and it's really made me think differently about education, is that it's the same as freedom of religion or freedom of thought or freedom of action. We pride ourselves on the First Amendment where, the state can't impose its religious views on us. And yet we turn our kids over to the state and say, well, don't impose your religious views, but impose every other view that you have. And so it's really just a license to indoctrinate. But why do we allow that? Why is how they feel about the family, how they feel about the relationship of a person to the government, how they feel about capitalism versus socialism, why is that fair game for our students or our schools to indoctrinate our students? It's not. To me, it's the same as freedom of religion. Get out of my kid's life. I don't want you telling them anything about that. So in my view, state-run schools are the most authoritarian, destructive, and dangerous institutions in our society, and they need to be abolished. I'm going to talk more about that later. So challenge number 3 is post-constitutionalism. And this may be the one that bothers me the most because, as I mentioned at the beginning of my preamble when I talked about American exceptionalism, the concept of a constitution that limits the behavior of our leaders was such a powerful change in the human race. And we're giving it away again. We're now entering what I call a post-constitutional society. Why is that happening? Well, the elites hate the Constitution. When you think about what it is, it's a document that ensures individual sovereignty. The elites don't want individual sovereignty. They want control. They want you to lose your sovereignty. They want you to give your life over to the state and the collective. And so ever since that Constitution's been implemented, the elites have realized that we've got to eat away at that. And I'm going to talk about how that happened. So in America today, we still have a constitution, but in my view, it just provides the forms of our government. So for instance, we have to elect a president every 4 years. Well, yeah, that's in the Constitution, so we do that. Or we have to have 100 senators. Well, yeah, that's in the Constitution, so we do that. But those are just forms. It's sort of like the structure of the government. But when you think about the substance, in the substance of the Constitution, if you read what the founders intended, was simply to protect individual sovereignty from encroachment by the elites and by their own government. That substance has been completely eaten out. We have the forms of our Constitution, but the substance is gone. In my view, the Constitution is now mere pieces of paper. I think there was an assumption that it had been part of our culture for so long that we can just sort of trust that it's got magical powers, that, yeah, we got a Constitution, and somehow magically it's going to protect us. But it's really just pieces of paper. It's just words on a paper. And when you get enough people in a country that decide, I'm just not going to follow it anymore, wow, you really just have words on a piece of paper. That's where we're at. Part of what's driven that, again, relating back to the education discussion we were having just a few minutes ago, is that entire generations, I'm going to say the last 2 generations that have come out of our school systems, have been programmed to shun the Constitution. For many reasons. Some say it was written hundreds of years ago, which means it's outdated, it doesn't apply to modern life, which is complete crap because it really defines the relationship of people to their government, and in my view, that's a timeless thing. They'll tell you it's written by slaveholders. Well, maybe it was. But what's that got to do with anything now? It really has nothing to do with it. It was written by those white patriarchs, those white supremacist old people that existed in America that wore goofy wigs and things. And it's also, and this is the most important thing, it's an artifact of American exceptionalism. In the last 2 generations of students have been taught that America's not exceptional. We just need to be like the rest of the world. We need to be like Europe. We need to be like the globalists in the world. We need to join the Paris Climate Accord. We need to join the United Nations. We need to do things globally, and that Americans are no different than anybody else. If you look at what's happening now, I would argue that all the branches of our government are ignoring the Constitution. All of them are completely ignoring the Constitution. And how did that come to be? I'm going to go through a little history here, and this is an important history. In my view, it began with the Civil War. And I don't know which side you favor, the North or the South or whatever. It really doesn't matter because the outcome of the war was a more powerful central government. Some of that is because during war you have to do things like suspend civil liberties, which Lincoln did. And you have to violate a lot of laws, and you have to violate the Constitution because that's just kind of what happens in war, and you have to do that. But also during the Reconstruction period after the war in the South, the federal government basically said states' rights no longer exist. We're going to tell the southern states what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and they're going to bend their knee to the federal government. We also saw during the Civil War the first instances of some of this power of the central government being implemented. We had our first income tax during the Civil War by the North. We also had our first draft in the Civil War. So you start to see this growing centralization of power in Washington and in the federal government coming out of the Civil War. At the start of the 20th century, progressivism started to sink its teeth into America. And there's a number of things happened that fundamentally transformed us, and this is the root of why our Constitution has been hollowed out. First of all, we had the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Well, why is that important? Well, the founders were actually very much opposed to the concept of national banks. And they feared a government that had control over the money supply for a couple of reasons. One, they can do anything they want with it. They can control the economy. If you control the money, you control the economy. But the other thing is you can print money. And that's actually a way around the whole political process, is if voters don't like what you're doing, if they don't like increased taxes, well, you can always just print more money, and that's what we're doing now. So that gave the government actually tremendous power. The other thing that happened in the same year, and this is not coincidental, is the 16th Amendment, which gave the government the power to tax incomes. So now when you think about that, you go, well, they used to, raising tax was kind of hard for our government. They had excise taxes and export-import taxes, but now they decided that we're just going to dig right into people's wallets directly and take their income. Now, of course, they started out and said, it's only 0.7%. It's only applying to the richest people, and that's all it'll ever be. Well, yeah, crap. Now that they got your hand in everyone's wallet. But what those two things did was it gave the government basically unlimited wealth. They could either tax your income if they wanted your wealth, or they could print the money and take your wealth through inflation. That was part of the demise of our Constitution. In FDR's New Deal, another thing happened in our country, which was this concept of becoming dependent on the state. And in 1935, we had the Social Security Act. Whether you like it, don't like it, it's really not the point. What it did was it made a very large group of people now dependent on the government for their sustenance in an important part of their life. Another event that's not quite as familiar to everybody, but I actually consider this one of the most important, is a Supreme Court case called Wickard versus Filbert in 1942. And what happened there was some poor gentleman named Filbert decided he wanted to grow stuff on his farm for his own consumption. He was in Ohio. And this was coming out of the Great Depression, where the government had instituted price controls on key commodities like food and production quotas. And they basically were telling people who could grow stuff and who couldn't grow it at what price. And that was part of their solution for the Great Depression. But Filbert said, well, I'm going to grow my own food. I have a farm. I'm going to grow my own food. So he did. And the federal government sued him. And they did it on the basis of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And their argument was, well, he's growing his own food, but any act that a producer does or a consumer does in the economy affects interstate commerce because it affects the supply, it affects the demand, and it affects the price. So the Supreme Court actually agreed with the government. And so think about this. We now have a government that has the power to print money, the power of unlimited taxation, and the power to describe any act as interstate commerce and therefore subject to be regulated by this government. Think about the power that government has at that point. And compare that to what the founders intended for our government. They did not intend that. It just got worse from there. In the 1960s, we had Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which created more dependence on the state. Then we had Obamacare, and soon it's going to become Medicare for All, which created even more dependence on the state. And the thing that ought to frighten everybody the most is this idea of the Green New Deal. Because it's sort of lumping all these thoughts together, they're going to tell us that the climate's a crisis, that the only way to resolve it is collective action, the only way to resolve it is to empower the government, and it's going to empower the state to have its tentacles in everything. They're going to tell you what kind of house you can have, they're going to tell you what kind of car you can drive, what kind of fuel you can use for whatever you're trying to power. They're going to tell you where you can go to school. They're going to try to push you into cities versus into rural areas. They're going to take control of everything. And what's happened is, this is the whole concept of progressivism, is it starts with little things and things that you think, well, that's not so bad. But by the time you get here, now that we've given the government all of this power, they are going to do that. And it's really just a function of, once you accept that the government is the fixer of all things, so that's kind of what we've done is, these are all fixes to things that we thought were problems in our society. But when you say the government is the fixer, it is also the controller. You can't fix without control. So the government is going to become the controller of everything in this country. And once the government controls everything, well, you can do the math. You control nothing. So, just a little thought experiment. If you pick up the Constitution and you read the articles and you say, all right, I think I understand this document. Where in that document does it authorize, for instance, transferring money from one citizen to another, saying, I'm going to take money from you and give it to you? And you can read that document any way you want to. There's nothing in it like that. Where does it authorize using the FBI and Homeland Security, like going into school board meetings, just to squelch internal dissent? Can you imagine Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison thinking, yeah, that's a good idea. I think we'll create these departments to go in and rat on people. Here's one that, to me, is the biggest challenge: globalism. This whole concept of being attached to extra-national organizations that aren't in our Constitution, that don't recognize the Constitution, that we have no power to control, like the United Nations, the Paris Climate Accord, the World Health Organization, the World Bank. It's interesting to see how the elites are pointing us all towards these things, that we have to honor the Paris Climate Accord, we have to do what the World Health Organization says. None of those organizations mean anything to our Constitution. They're all outside our country. They're all extra-national. Any power we give to those groups is actually inherently a violation of our Constitution. We're a sovereign country, and we make those decisions for ourselves. But that concept is going away. The whole issue of open borders. How can you say you have a Constitution that means anything if you don't even have a country that means anything? If you can't even really define, where's my border, who's in this country, who's not in this country? Really? So we have a Constitution? And those things don't mix well. What was frightening to me during the COVID pandemic, I don't know how you all felt about it, but the government's willingness to violate almost every article of the Constitution during the COVID lockdown. And initially it was going to be 2 weeks because we got to flatten the curve and find out what we're up against. Well, that 2 weeks has become almost 2 years now. And it was astonishing to see how easy it was for the government to simply dictate how we're going to suspend your civil rights, to go to church, to assemble. They closed businesses. They literally just decided to close businesses. And they forced millions and millions of people into unemployment. How can we say we have a constitution when our government, without any vote, without even the legislature doing anything, our government just simply said, we're going to do this, we're going to turn the society upside down. It's another indication we really don't have a constitution anymore. We also have a surveillance state now, and they're gathering more and more data every day on every one of us. And they'll tell you, geez, if you got nothing to hide, what do you got to worry about? Well, that whole thought of if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about, that came from Joseph Goebbels of the Nazi Party in Germany. So I guarantee you that all of this data that they're gathering, you may not have anything to worry about today, but you're going to find out that there's probably millions of laws you don't even know exist. Even if you look at the tax code, there's literally thousands and thousands of pages of the tax code. Somewhere in there you've broken a law. Somewhere in there you've violated the tax code. Somewhere in there you've done something that you wish somebody didn't know about. But they're going to know about it. And what's coming next, and we've heard a lot about it, is the government's going to want to see every transaction from every bank of every person who has more than $600 in the bank. Think of what that knowledge would do. Yeah, Mr. Smith, where did that $1,000 come from? I'd like to see the documentation that supports that. I'd like you to prove to me you paid taxes on that. It exposes everybody in this country to a tyrannical government. The other thing that is frightening is that as our government does these things, there's huge pieces of our society that are sort of rushing in to joint link arms with them. And they become part of this elitist movement because they see that the government now has enormous power, that we're making this move towards collectivism, and they're trying to find ways to enrich themselves as that happens. So you look at big media, big education, the big bureaucracy, big tech, big pharma, big finance. There's a lot of collusion now between those big organizations in our society and our governments. Just to take the COVID thing as an example, a couple of points. The government's move to take a lot of small businesses out of operation for years led to what? Well, for instance, Amazon got very rich because your local guy who probably could have sold you something was put out of business. So now everybody has to go to Amazon, and Jeff Bezos, who funds a lot of this leftist movements and who owns the Washington Post, the leftist paper that justifies all this stuff, he became fabulously wealthy during this COVID crisis. What about Big Pharma during the COVID crisis? They told us we couldn't have free therapeutics, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. We're going to make you take a very expensive vaccine that's going to make billions of dollars for these big pharma companies. You're seeing more and more of that collusion between these elitist big companies and the people who have political power in our country. And it's a terrible thing that's going on. I'm going to argue that the federal government can now do anything it pleases. And we saw that during the COVID lockdown. We're going to see that when the climate change initiatives start to get implemented. The government is simply going to take the power to do whatever it pleases. And what that means is the Constitution of America has been defamed. Challenge number 4. And this is an interesting one to me because we talk about America as sort of this monolithic country, and we're all in it together, and we're all Americans. But there's actually 2 Americans. I don't know if you've noticed this, but that war between people who believe in individual sovereignty and believe in limited government versus those who believe in collectivism and a centralized national state, that war has divided us. That the identity politics, the class warfare, the grievance culture is tearing our country in two. So now you have really two countries. One is the classical liberalism of our founding fathers, and the other is the neo-Marxist collectivist creep that's been going on in the country the last 150 years. Another way to look at it is the people who believe that this is a limited constitutional republic versus those who simply want a centralized nanny state to tell us all what to do. A lot of people will also say, well, those two things can live together side by side, and we can all get along and live peacefully. They can't. Those two competing philosophies are completely irreconcilable in the long run. And why do I say that? If you look at the basic elements of our political foundation, like the concept of freedom, the people who are the classical liberals who believe in our founding structure and individual sovereignty believe that freedom is really protection from coercion. We don't want foreign countries to come in and attack us. We don't want criminals to take our stuff. We don't want a government to tell us what to do. We want to be able to pick where we live, who we associate with, where our kids go to school, where we shop, where we go to church. We want that freedom. I just don't want to be coerced, and I want my government to protect me from that. Well, that's one view of freedom. It's a whole different view of freedom in our culture. And I don't think a lot of people realize this, but when you ask a lot of young people, what do you mean by freedom? It isn't what I just described. They want to be freedom from the harshness of reality. They want to be free from having to worry about how they're going to be fed, how they're going to pay for school, how they're going to get their first house, how their student loan debt's going to be forgiven. They want to be free from reality, and they want the government to take enough control to free them from that. And it's really an outgrowth of Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he talked about his four freedoms. He was a progressive, and he actually started that thought process, that people want to be free from worry and free from this and free from that. That's a whole different freedom than freedom from coercion. But it's deeply embedded in our society. There's whole generations now who want to be free from the harshness of reality, and they want the government to have the power to do that for them. The whole concept of property. Our country was founded on the concept that you own your own life, and you own what your life produces. You know, what your hands and your mind produce, that's yours. You own that. Now, if you fast forward to Barack Obama's famous comment where you didn't build that, there's now a whole part of our culture that thinks you don't really own your own life, that society and the collective owns it, that you didn't really do that, you don't deserve it, that it's just because you were privileged or something, and the society owns your property. An even deeper view of that conflict of two Americas is the concept of moral virtue. And if you think about the founding of America, that whole concept of individual sovereignty brought with it a concept of individual responsibility. And what that meant was you were responsible for your own messes. If you did something good, you got to reap the benefits. If you did something bad, you were going to pay the price for it. You're responsible for your own actions. What we have now growing in our culture is this notion that moral virtue is unnecessary. That it doesn't matter whether you succeed or fail, it doesn't matter whether you do anything good or bad, it doesn't matter whether you're a good person, a productive person, or whatever. The government will simply step in for you and clean up your messes. So I submit to you that if you've got a group of people that think in a classical liberalism sense, and a group of people that think in that neo-Marxist collectivist creed, they can never live together in one harmonious society because they see the basic relationship between government and people completely differently. And that's why we're seeing a lot of this conflict in America. So when you look at that, you say, well, is there conflict in America? Well, I would submit that if you look at what's happened in just the last year or two, we've had riots in our cities, rising crime, soaring inflation, empty shelves in the stores, even though we've got container ships parked in our harbors, help wanted signs everywhere, but poor service, statues being torn down and our history being rewritten, anarchists taking over our urban conclaves, Black Lives Matter and Antifa fomenting violence around the country. Our president was impeached twice. We had some shadow coups, the Russian hoax, and the election fraud that we had in 2020. We've got calls now for reparations, meaning one group of people has to pay money to another group. And this whole cancel culture that's attempting to silence everyone. you look at that, and this is just what's happened in the last year or two, and it becomes clear to me that there really are two Americas now, and that we're very close to being at war with each other. Challenge number 5, the grand illusion. This is what makes fighting this battle so difficult right now, because truth has been destroyed. When you look at truth and science in America right now, they've been hijacked, they've been politicized, they've been tribalized. And so what you have now, since we have two Americas, is there's two versions of truth and science. And you can just see it when you look at the media that, wow, this group of media sees the world this way. And then you look at the opposite media and it's like, I'm not sure what planet you're on, but what color is the sky in your world? But we're supposedly, we're all looking at the same thing, but there's just simply two versions of truth and science. What's frustrating is the elites who run our society now, in their own political posturing and genius, describe what they're doing as science. And what they tell us, everyone else here, that what we're thinking and doing is ignorance. We call it common sense, they call it ignorance. Sharon mentioned that earlier, that we have common sense on our side, but the elites say they have science on their side. What makes that a big challenge is you can say, well, hey, my common sense trumps their science. It probably does. But all of the megaphones in our society right now are owned by the left. And so when you think about mainstream culture and mainstream media, they're all in lockstep with the grand illusion here, that they all believe in this science that's being postured by the elites. So, when you do a search engine, you'll get your results manipulated. The fact-checking that goes on in our social media is really just partisan hacks. We're being shadow banned if you express anything contrary to the science of the elites. And they're even openly censoring and deplatforming people who dissent from that. So we can say our common sense is right, and I believe it to be, but when there are forces opposing us that own all of the megaphones in society, it makes it a terrible challenge for us. I'm also going to submit, and this is one of those things that may offend some people, but our two-party political system is part of the grand illusion now. And I say that because most of the national candidates are really beholden to the elites that are running this country. And if you look at what comes out of Washington, you just want to bang your head against the wall, because even the people you think are on your side are not on your side. They really aren't. The whole issue of election integrity, it's hard to say that our two-party political system has legitimacy when I don't even know if they can count votes correctly. What does this even mean? I'm not real sure who won anything in 2020. The Republican Party has frustrated me. I think they're part of the illusion, at least at the national level. As Sharon mentioned, I got involved in 2009 after Obama was elected in the Tea Party movement. And I was very excited and enthused at first because we had a lot of victories. In 2010, we won the House. The next election cycle, we won the Senate, and then we won the presidency. It seemed like, well, hey, that's progress. We had some power here. But then when you look at, okay, we gave the Republicans the House, we gave them the Senate, we gave them the presidency. What did they do with it? I mean, we still have Obamacare. That was one of the things in 2009 that was firing up the base here. Well, it's still there. And it's part of that ratchet effect that I talked about earlier, where when the left gets in power, they add this extra program, this new regulation, this new benefit, this new entitlement. When the Republicans get in, well, maybe they slow it down a little, but none of that stuff ever goes away. And then when the left gets back in power, well, they add more programs, more entitlements, more of this, and the Republicans get in, and well, it just sort of all stays there. So that's the ratchet effect that is really killing this country, and the Republicans aren't helping us. I know there's a lot of Republicans in the room, but I'm just suggesting that we got to expect more of them than what they've delivered so far. Okay, so I've kind of bitched and moaned for a while about what's wrong. What's the path forward? Well, I'm going to go through these things in the context of what I described as the problem. And again, it isn't the problem of the moment, the hour, the day, or the week. The first thing we need to do is to resist collectivism in the deep state. And by this, I mean we have to resist everything. And I don't think we do enough of that. I know we say, yeah, I do, but everything that happens in our politics right now is moving in the wrong direction. We're adding more entitlement programs, more regulations, more impositions on life. But we sort of just accept it. It really just keeps coming at us. And even in our discussions with people, I think we're afraid to say, no, we can't do that. We can't object to that. We can't fight that because that'll make us seem antisocial, or it'll make us seem like we hate poor people, or we hate black people, or we hate whatever. So everybody I think there's still a reluctance to just resist this stuff. It's wrong. It's just plain wrong. And it's our role as citizens to say, I object. I object loudly. I'm going to object to my leaders. I'm going to object to everybody around me. I'm going to object to my family. I'm going to object to my neighbors. One thing I think we forget, and this is an interesting phenomenon, is that we outnumber these elites, these people in these urban enclaves like Washington who really run our society. We outnumber them by the millions and millions. There's a lot of us. And yet, it's almost like we're afraid to confront them. It's almost just too natural to submit to them. And I'm going to talk now about something I was going to talk about. That there was a book called Ordinary Men. I don't know if any of you read it, but it was sort of a study of why did these people in Germany, who are ordinary good people, allow the Nazi totalitarianism to evolve to the point where it was the most venal, destructive thing on the history of the world. These ordinary people let that happen. And part of it was they simply didn't realize that, there really aren't that many Nazis. There aren't that many people in the SS. There aren't that many people in the Nazi Party. But somehow they were frightened and intimidated and thought, well, I can't stand up to them. I have to be quiet. They're going to throw me in jail. They're going to do whatever. So it was amazing how a small group of tyrannical people could turn an entire society into murderers. I'm not suggesting we're there yet. I'm just suggesting that's happened in history. And we need to be very careful about silence here. Silence is entirely the wrong approach. I'm going to suggest that we need to do a little bit of civil disobedience. And by that I mean refuse. And whatever the government's trying to do, if they ask you to fill out a form, don't do it. Let's see what happens. If they ask you to sign into a database and register to a database, don't do it. Let's see what happens. If they ask you to get a shot in your arm, don't do it. Let's see what happens. Now, I'm not suggesting, I know everybody has things they have to worry about in their private lives, and I'm not suggesting you ruin your life for this, but I'm suggesting you start to pick and choose. Well, what am I just not going to do? Because, again, we outnumber them by the millions. We can't allow this to go on. We have to start to pick things that we're just going to refuse to do, even if it's the smallest thing. Whatever this elitist bureaucracy wants us to do, think about saying no. I'm just not going to do it. At some point, we'll retake power. We need to think for ourselves, and I know I know most of you do, but it's also hard, from what I mentioned earlier, where the left has the megaphones in our society. And it's actually kind of frustrating. I even find myself thinking that, well, maybe I'm wrong on that. Hit myself on the side of the head and say, no, I'm not. I know I'm right. It's just there's 100 people saying I'm wrong. You've got to have the courage to believe you're right, and not only believe you're right, but to tell everybody around you that I'm right. Because part of this is silence is surrender. Again, the point I made about the book Ordinary Men in Nazi Germany, far too many people were silent. It was just too easy to go along one more day. Oh, that's not quite so bad. I'll just tolerate it. I don't want to get thrown in jail. Another day goes by. Well, that's not so bad. I'll just tolerate it. 20 years later, from when the Nazi Party took power, they were incinerating people in ovens. We cannot allow this move toward collectivism in America to proceed any further. It's time to stand up and not be silent anymore. So the second thing in the path forward, we need to completely dismantle state-run education. I'm going to argue that there's no hope of success without doing this, because, as I said earlier, when the state owns the minds of your children, they're going to pump out statists and collectivists forever. And we now have a couple of generations of that happening, and you can see the effect on our society. So there's a number of small things we can do, like support homeschooling. Even if your kids aren't, you don't have kids who are school-aged, you can at least make sure that if there's things on the ballot that make it harder for homeschooling to happen, or things your school board are doing to make it harder for homeschooling to happen, get in the way of them, stop them, fight them. We need to agitate to disband the federal Department of Education. There's no reason on earth why some group in Washington needs to tell a family in Michigan how their students should be educated. There is no reason on earth why that should happen. We should end Common Core. Common Core is really just an attempt to standardize the preaching of collectivism in our schools. We need to starve the beast. If there's a millage increase on your ballot, I don't care what they tell you about the fancy new pool they're going to give you, or the 8 administrators they're going to hire, or whatever. Reject it. Vote no. Start to starve the beast. We can't continue to fund this. Another important thing is school boards work for us. I think they've forgotten that we actually pay their salaries. They're our employees, and yet they think they're king of the education world. And we need to make their lives miserable if they forget that. I know a lot of you are involved in that, but this is another thing where we shall not be silent. These are our kids, these are our schools, these people work for us, and by golly, we're going to tell you what we think. But the most important thing, and this is a thought that I came to maybe last year, and it's going to become a big part of what I work on going forward in the future, is we need to privatize all schools. That there ought not to be such a thing as a state-run school. And by that I mean there ought not to be a school that's owned by the state, that's run by the state, that's where the teachers are employed by the state. That simply ought not to exist. And what we should change to is a privatized process where if we're going to fund it with public money, fine, but the money follows the student. And the parents decide where they want their student to go to school and where they want to spend that money. And it's done in a private setting. There is no such thing as a state-run school. And from there, well, once you create that system of competition and privatize that, then you let each school set their curriculum based on the demand. Like, not everybody's going to think like we do. That's fine. They can send their kids to the kind of school they want to send them to. Well, by golly, I want to send my child to a school I want my child to go to. And so let the free market control that rather than the government controlling how they're going to be indoctrinated. So if we don't do this in some way, shape, or form, if we don't take the schools back from the state, we'll never solve the problem, because it's the state that's pumping out young statists and collectivists every year. We have to solve this problem. I think there's some weaknesses in the Constitution. As I mentioned, as I went through some of the history of how we made these movements towards becoming a collectivist society, it was actually far too easy for the government to take some power, whether it was through the Income Tax Act or the Federal Reserve Act or some of these other things. So, in my view, an important thing to do is have term limits everywhere. And I mean everywhere. So the concept of a Joe Biden who's been in public service his entire life, to me is an abomination. Not because he's Joe Biden, but because the notion that someone can become so embedded in the deep state of our country, where they've never worked in the private sector, they've exposed themselves their entire life to a procession of lobbyists and moneyed interests and all this political intrigue that goes on. What do you think you're going to get from that person at the end of 20 years, 30 years, or 40 years? They're going to be nothing but part of the deep state. Even good people that have gone to Washington that I admire and respect, after 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, I start to look at those people like you become one of them. And it's only natural. And I think not only for the politicians that we elect, but I'm going to suggest that any bureaucrat that works in Washington ought to have a limit on their career. This idea that we're going to have a deep state of people who have spent their entire lives in the bureaucracy telling us what to do and how to live, with no exposure to what the real world is like, to me is an abomination. And this is part of why we've run astray from our Constitution, is that there's become a whole separate political class in Washington that is different than us. And we've allowed that to happen, and that political class controls our lives. We need to put some hard limits on legislative prerogatives. This is an interesting one because if you look at how the founders, what they were thinking when they structured the Constitution, they actually gave the legislature a fair amount of latitude. And they did that because in our republic, that elected people should reflect the will of the people, and they expected that to happen. But back then, the will of the people was, hey, we believe in individual sovereignty and limited government. That was the will of the people. So the founders kind of felt, okay, let's let that happen. But as it turned out, as the culture in the country changed to one of being more collectivist and anti-individual sovereignty, the legislatures went amok. And so we need to find ways to cap the activity of it, whether we have a limit on how much the budget can be based on percentage of GDP. And it doesn't matter what the legislature does, it can't be bigger than that percentage. We have to insist on a balanced budget, meaning you're not going to print money or you're not going to spend your children's money. The concept of a flat tax, like a national sales tax, where one has some skin in the game, or preventing wealth transfers from one citizen or group to another. Another thing that I think is important is auditing the personal financials of every bureaucrat and politician. It's amazing to me how people enter our government poor and come out rich. And the math just doesn't work when you look at their salaries. And I think they ought to do an audit every year, from when they're elected annually, and then when they leave office, they ought to be audited again one last time. And the results of those audits ought to be made public to everyone. These people work for us. We're entrusting them with a lot of power and a lot of money. And we have a right to know what's really going on, who's benefiting from that. So now, the most important point. In my view, the only way this is going to be resolved is if the states reassert their states' rights in the 9th and 10th Amendment. We have to remember that the federal government and the Constitution are both creatures of the states. It was the states that ratified them, it was the states that created those things. It's only the states that have sufficient power to reassert control in this country if they have the will to do it. We're not going to do it by ourselves. I mean, we don't have the tools or the mechanisms by which to do it, but the states do. So I'm going to argue that we need to pay a lot more attention to who we're electing in our state and local elections and why we're electing them. And I don't think it's sufficient just to allow them to say, hey, I'm a conservative, so elect me. I actually want to know two things that are really important to me, and they're the only two things that are going to affect this. How do you feel about asserting state sovereignty? And how do you feel about dismantling state-run education? We don't ask those questions of our conservative leaders enough. Yeah, we ask them what they feel about this House bill or that Senate bill or this particular issue. But it's these two things, the ability to reassert state sovereignty and the ability to dismantle our state-run education. Those are the paths to fixing what's wrong in America. And we need to start to demand that. We can't just ask our leaders, are you conservative or not? We have to demand that they're willing to support these two things. Another thing you ought to give some thought to is if your state is hopelessly collectivist, like if you lived in California, for instance, I would suggest moving. Because it's time that the people who respect the concept of individual sovereignty and limited government, we need to pool our power. And if what I'm saying is true, that states' rights is really what's going to win this battle, we need to get our power funneled to a state that will actually do something about that, whether it's a Florida, a Texas, a South Dakota. I'd like to think that we could turn Michigan around. I'm a little skeptical about that. What we have to remember, and I know I'm talking about Washington like they're the enemy, but in some ways they are. And I consider myself a true patriot, but what I'm patriotic to is our constitutional principles. And that's where my allegiance stands. These usurpers that are in Washington, these people that are tearing our country apart, and in my view, betraying our country, I have no allegiance to them. And so I think this path of states' rights, retaking control from Washington, is the only path that's possible for us. So just to wrap up here, we have to be prepared to assert our natural right to disband any government. And I know I'm getting a little ahead of myself because I don't think we're to that point yet. But one of the things I learned about negotiating is if you're not willing to walk away from the deal, you've already lost the negotiation. So we have to start to get this mentality in our minds that, you know what, at some point, if this doesn't start to go the right way, if state sovereignty doesn't start to become a reality, well, we need to think about walking away from the deal and doing something different. One of the lessons from the founders is that, you know, you can't always play by the rules of the elites. And for a long time, they played by England's rules. If you look like at 1750, 1760, a lot of the founders were still very passionate British citizens. They loved Britain, they loved being part of the empire, they loved some of the traditions of Britain, and they really didn't like the idea of revolting against them. But they also realized, somewhere around 1775, that if you continue to play by their rules, you're never going to win the game. When they're setting the rules of the game, sometimes you're just screwed. And you need to think differently. And sometimes common people need to think about, well, here's some rules I'd rather live by. A little wisdom from Thomas Jefferson. A little rebellion is a good thing. And it's necessary in the political world as storms are in the physical. He said it a little bit differently, and this is actually in one of our founding documents. And I don't think we take this to heart enough. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. That's what they did in 1776. So at the end, what the founders were really telling us is politically, you have three options. You can have an election and pick new leaders. We've done a lot of that with not a lot of great effect, in my opinion. If you don't like the way your Constitution is working right now, you can amend that Constitution. That's going to be a hard thing to do in our culture, I think. Ultimately, though, you can always pick a new government. I'm not suggesting that's the next step for us. I'm just planting a seed that if we don't start to think about that as an option for us, we're never going to win this fight. They have to realize that we actually do think that's an option. It's like I said, if you're not willing to walk away from the table, you've already lost the negotiation. So that was my presentation. Allow myself 30 seconds just to pitch my book here. I've written a book called 2084 American Apocalypse. It's actually a mystery novel. It's a very gripping novel with a lot of twists and turns, some rather startling things. But it's also a novel of very powerful ideas. It's written in the same genre as 1984 or Atlas Shrugged. And it contains a lot of what I've talked about today. If you take a look at the current trends in America and where they're taking us, if we don't do something different about those trends, I'm predicting some dire things in our future. So I'd like to give that a little bit of thought. And I do have a trailer that was developed for the book that I'd like to just show you. It takes, again, about 60 seconds. What I'd like to do is, if you have a few minutes and you have some questions, I'd like to open the floor for some questions, and hopefully I have an answer.
I think what you said regarding states' rights is exactly right. Right now, you have midnight flights over to various states with illegal aliens on board. They're landing in Florida, other states. I think those governors are arrested immediately as soon as that flight lands. And I don't understand why not. I don't understand why Abbott in Texas is not putting a National Guard on his border to stop this. I think Republican governors are not doing enough.
Well, I agree with that, and I think the Republicans have let us down in many, many ways. When you think about how the country was formed, there was this concept of subsidiarity, meaning you had a sovereign individual who maybe had allowed some local community power to some local politicians, maybe a little bit of power at the state level. Almost nothing in the Constitution was empowered at the federal level. But that's been turned completely upside down now, and part of it is our culture where everybody pleads for the federal government to do something whenever there's a crisis. If there's a terrible storm, if there's a pandemic, if there's whatever going on in society, the plea is almost automatically now, hey, the federal government has to do something, the president has to do something. That's completely the wrong answer. It's the states that should address those. And if you allow the federal government to address them and to push the states aside, we will always be in this mode of being subservient to these bureaucrats in Washington. We have to break that cycle. I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, I was alarmed during the pandemic. When we started the voting measures, how our legislature didn't act, didn't do anything. The voting up in Antrim County, the Republicans have an investigation and find that there was no fraud, there was nothing wrong, nothing at all. And they didn't want to pursue it any further. They didn't do anything. And as citizens, as people, I feel so helpless because I don't feel like everybody's growing the same way as far as the Republicans go. I just don't understand.
Well, I agree with you, and I know a lot of us who vote Republican have an instinct to say, well, I don't want that Democrat in office, and I don't. I don't believe in hardly anything the Democrats do. But we have to take the same anger and frustration to the Republicans that are in office. We have to tell them that I find that unacceptable, you're wrong, and you're not going to be here the next election if you continue that. If we don't do that, we have no power. Like I said, both parties are part of the illusion right now. We have to break that illusion, and we have to make the Republicans feel more miserable than we make the Democrats feel.
But as just as individuals, you look at the high-tech, the big companies that are using this wokeness and teaching critical race theory and stuff. And how do you? I don't drink Coca-Cola because I feel like I shouldn't be ashamed to be a white. I stopped watching football games because I think the national anthem and the fellows that died for this country are being disgraced. But all these big companies, George Soros, Zuckerberg, and his $419 million dollars that he spent on the 2020 election. How can we as individuals, how can we even compete with, trying to get our voice?
Well, one way to lose that competition is to remain silent. And I know there's people in this audience here are very vocal, and I appreciate that. But we have to be vocal everywhere. And I know I even find myself sometimes, when I'm in a mixed group of, some leftists and whatever, that I find myself walking on eggshells a little bit. Well, I'm starting to hit myself in the head again and say, quit walking on eggshells. There's a lot at stake here. We can't. Part of why this wokeness has swept the country is the people who don't think that's the right path forward are just not saying enough. We're not loud enough. We're not rejecting enough. We're not fighting enough. And we have to do that. That's part of our role to stop that. Yes.
Want to build your back, but I think part of that about the silence is, and I'm just going to be upfront with everybody. I've been in big pharma for 24 years. I'm still working on it, very big. But a lot of us have investigated so much about COVID that I find myself compelled to tell people whether they're vaccinated or they've had the data that I found. And being part of the big pharma, right? Because if we can reveal that level of corruption and ask the question, is this really about a virus? Or what is it really about? You can open people's eyes. I didn't talk to friends who were convinced of the vaccine, the Apple vaccine, people say. And once they start revealing data to them, it's almost like some of them are not only shocked, they're a bit embarrassed that they didn't investigate themselves and that they took the vaccine. But I think if you reveal that kind of stuff to people, whether it's a vaccine or something to government, we can reveal corruption little by little ourselves. And that's where, versus keeping silent, at least we can open people's eyes to things.
Well, I think that's true. Again, the challenge is 90% of the media in our culture is running contrary to what you just said, or basically everything that we talk about. So that just means we have to be louder.
Except that there's a lot of resources out there to look up. I've got a whole group of people you can share data and videos and
there are a lot of resources out there, and I'm not saying I'm an expert. I'm only known enough for years. It's not from a doctor, but there are a lot of videos and YouTubes and documents that you can share about the corruption level of this vaccine, quote unquote vaccine, and you can share it. And they're not from conspiracy theorists. They're not from quacks. They're from scientists. They're from internationally known virologists and MDs. And then they want any of that information. I'm happy to talk to them and give you some tips.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I agree completely with what you're saying. My wife and I have explored a lot of those alternative views of COVID, and there is tremendous data out there, great data, contrary data to the public memes that are out there. What makes it difficult, and again, this is why we need to speak up, is like if you look at the younger people, they're almost mesmerized by it. They're not hearing enough of the contrary view. There's so much peer pressure to accept what's being said by the authorities that they hear so many people saying it that they think, well, that must be true just because so many people are saying it. Even though you have the facts at your disposal, even though you're right, in my opinion, not enough people are hearing it. The young people aren't hearing it. And that's part of our job is we simply have to be louder than we're being right now.
So dismantling the state education, that's a great goal. But that's not going to happen overnight. So, what would you suggest? What would be the first steps towards that? Besides pulling our kids, doing the homeschooling, do you think taking over school boards would be steps towards that end?
Yes, I mean, anything that we can do right now to stop the tide and to try to turn the tide is important to do because we all can make contributions in many ways, and not everybody has to be the one who changes the world and puts an end to state-run education. I mean, we're not all going to be the person who does that. But there is something we can do, and I do think, as I mentioned in my presentation, that making the lives miserable of our school board members who think they are supreme deities. I think we need to do that. I think we need to be loud, we need to be forceful, we need to vote them out. Those are important steps. But I will also say that we need to start the conversation about privatizing schools completely. Because if we don't start that conversation, it'll never get anywhere and it'll never come. And I don't think we'll ever solve this problem of collectivism until we do that. Jim?
I just wanted to comment
About what Jim said about states' rights. We've talked about this a lot at the dinner table. Right now, there's multiple people running for governor. Some of them are pretty accessible right now, some of them not so much. But I would say I would start questioning whoever this person is that you're thinking about voting for, because this is next year, how they feel about taking on the federal government and reasserting the authority that they have as far as states. We talked about that. I wish that more governors, like Abbott and DeSantis, I wish they would start coming together and they would start showing some muscle as combined governors that are saying to the federal government, nope. And I think that we need to start understanding more and more what our governors and what our state can do against the federal government. And maybe we should be reminding some of these people that are running for that position and start questioning how much are you going to let the Pelosi's and the Bidens and the Harrisons tell us what we're going to do, even coming down into our states and telling the states what we're going to do. So I'm just saying, you guys, you have options right now of meeting candidates before they start getting like really consultant up or couched on their responses. Right now they're pretty accessible, and I would encourage you to start asking tough questions like that, because I believe what Jim says. States' rights is where it's at right now. And I will have to say I agree with Connie, and start raising some hell with some of these locals too. So.
Yes.
There's something that can be done to stop people like Soros and such that most belong to our country are not citizens, but they're controlling like prosecutors now, getting them elected, pumping tons of money. Another one that's a real sleeper is Bill Gates. I mean, he's like real.
Yeah, I agree. And when I condemn elitists, it's not just politicians that I'm condemning. It's these people like the Bill Gates and the George Soroses of the world who have found a way to link arms with the politicians of the world and use the levers of the state to do us great harm. Again, the only way we're going to have sufficient political force to fight that with, we're never going to resolve this at the federal government level. The federal government's gone. It's owned by these elitists that you're describing. The media owns it. It's just gone. I hate to say that, but it is. The states are not gone, at least not all. In fact, there's a lot of states that, if we could properly energize their leadership and hold their leadership accountable, might someday get the backbone to stand up to the federal government and say, I'm just not going to do that. And I dare you to do anything about it. I think that's the battle. That's why I said states' rights is where we have to fight this. We're not going to fight the Soroses of the world by trying to do anything different at the federal government level. There's nothing we can do. Okay. Sharon gave me the heads up. We got to go. Really appreciate your attention today. Hopefully I challenged your thinking a little bit, and feel free to ask.